Hello everyone, and welcome to round 12 of the 1970 Interzonal tournament of Palma de Mallorca. After 5 consecutive wins, Bobby Fischer had 2 draws, a loss against Bent Larsen, and then another 2 draws. So definitely not going in the way that he wanted it to go, and now he faces definitely one of the strongest opponents in this tournament, and he has the black pieces against him. It is of course Efim Geller, not only a member of the World Grandmaster Elite, but also he won the Soviet Championship twice. He qualified for the Candidates Series 6 times, and we all know him to be a producer of World Chess Champions, as he did coach Boris Spassky and later Anatoly Karpov. So definitely a tough customer. But before we check out the game, I do have a nice photo challenge. Pretty sure you'll all know this one, but you know, in case you don't, it's always nice to learn something. So here it is. Best of luck to everyone. Sorry, not that. That's a photo of them playing, but I have it prepared here. Who is this young fellow here? And there is a certain movie that was made after this young fellow. So I think that pretty much says it all. Best of luck to everyone. Now we don't have a photo of this matchup in particular, but we do have a photo of Geller playing against Fischer. I don't know the exact origin of the photo. I'm pretty sure it's from the 1962 Curacao Candidates Tournament, but I could be wrong. I'm pretty sure it is. So there you have it. Now let's check out the game. Geller opens with knight to f3. Sorry about that. He opens with knight to f3, the Reti opening, and Fischer goes knight to f6, like in his game of the century. And it is something that after seeing that game, I will often just make my against the Reti opening. I will often make 4 of my first moves: knight f6, g6, bishop g7, and simply castles. And you know, if Fischer played it, it must be okay. So c4, we have g6, g3, bishop g7, bishop g2, and Fischer castles. Geller castles, and now c6. Fischer prepares d5. d4, d5, c captures on d4, c captures on d4, and now knight to e5. Fischer goes bishop to f5, prepares a knight to e4 after Geller develops the knight. So knight to c3. Fischer immediately wants to exchange pieces. We have bishop to e3, and now knight captures on c3. Pawn captures on c3, and the knight to c6 now. Geller captures on c6, b captures on c6, and now queen to a4. Developing the queen and also attacking the c6 pawn. Fischer defends it, queen to b6, and now rook 8 to c1. And here, a reasonable move would be something like rook f to b8. So, you know, just developing the rook to a nice square, and then this a rook will be defending the a pawn. You can push the a pawn, you can infiltrate with the queen, maybe you can offer a queen trade, but Fischer chooses a different idea. He goes rook 8 to b8 and leaves the f8 rook on the beginning square. And okay, we have c4, bishop captures on d4, bishop captures on d4, queen captures on d4, and now e3. So a temporary pawn sacrifice by Geller, but as you'll soon find out, it is not only temporary. We have queen to e5, and now c captures on d5. C captures on d5, and now not immediately going after the a7 pawn. You could capture it, but then after e6, defending the d5 pawn, Geller could start pushing the a4 pawn, but then rook to b2 is coming. The other rook can come to b8. Fischer will get a lot of activity here, and it's very unlikely that this a4 pawn will be able to do something. So after c captures on d5, rook f to d1. First, Geller goes after the d5 pawn and develops the rook. Fischer blocks it. We have e6, and only now does Geller capture on a7. We have rook to a8 attacking Geller's queen, queen to d4, and now queen captures on d4. Rook captures on d4, and now Fischer captures the passed pawn. Rook captures on a2. e4 by Geller. We have captures, bishop captures, and the rook captures. So it's already moved 25. They've pretty much exchanged everything. There are 4 rooks left on the board. Fischer has 4 pawns. Geller has 3 pawns, and all of the pawns are on the king side. So basically, all in all, most likely this will be a draw. But Fischer is not interested in a draw. He wants to play this position out, which is something we very often see in games of Magnus Carlsen. He doesn't mind playing a position that is considered to be drawn even for you know, 2 or 3 hours more, and such was the case. Such was the case of Fischer. Rook to b8. We have rook to e3, and now g5. Fischer prevents white from expanding with f4 or h4. We have h3, king to g7, and now rook to c7. We have king to g6 and rook to f3. Geller now goes after the f7 pawn. So Fischer plays f6, we have rook to e7, going after the e6 pawn, and now rook to e2, simply defending. G4, we have rook to b1 check, king to g2, and now comes rook 2 to e1. And now if Geller isn't careful, if he plays a silly move like rook to a7, then he will be easily checkmated after rook to g1 check. King h2, rook to h1 check, king g2, and now rook to g1 will be checkmate. So after rook e to e1, we have rook to a3 by Geller, and now Fischer plays h5. Rook a to a7. Now Geller is the one actually threatening checkmate via rook to g7, h7, and then the other rook will come to g7 to deliver checkmate. Fischer plays rook to g1 check. We have king to f3, and now h captures on g4 with check. Pawn captures, and now rook to b3 check. The king has to move. King to e2, and now capturing the g4 pawn. Now the king can move, and there will be no checkmate. So rook captures on e6, and now there are still four rooks on the board. Fischer has 2 pawns against 1 pawn on the king side. Still very, very hard to push for any kind of advantage here, but Fischer is relentless. Rook to b1, we have rook to a6 now with a double attack against the f6 pawn. Rook to f4 defending the f6 pawn, and now rook back to a2. Geller cannot allow Fischer to play rook to b2 check and pick up the f2 pawn. So rook has to block it, and now rook to h1. Fischer wants to attack the f2 pawn via the h2 square. We have rook back to a6. Now comes rook to g4, rook to b4, and now rook to a4, offering a trade of rooks. We have rook to b1, and now rook back to a8. Rook to g1, and now king to f3. We have rook to b5, rook a to a5, again offering a trade of rooks, and Fischer declines. Rook to b3. King to e2, we have rook b to b1, and now rook back to a8, repeating of the position. And Fischer tries to infiltrate the position with his king. King to f5. Rook 2 to a5, delivering check. King goes to g4, now comes rook a4 check. King h5, and now rook to h8 check. King to g6. So Fischer just made a nice trip with his king. We have rook to g8 check, king to f7, and rook goes back to d8. And now rook to e1 check. King to f3, and now rook to e5. Perhaps Fischer will now be able to, create a nice outpost for his king on f5. Rook to d2, rook to f5 with check, king moves, and now rook to e5 with check. King to f3, and now king to g6. We have rook to e4, offering a trade of rooks. Fischer declines, rook to f5 check, king moves to e2, and now comes rook back to a5. Rook to e3. Fischer tries king to h5, and now rook e to d3. Rook a to a1, we have rook to d8, and now comes f5. Finally, an opportunity presents itself for Fischer to push a pawn, so he does it. f5. King to f3, we have rook to a3 check, rook blocks, and now comes g4 with check. King to f4, and now comes rook captures on d3. Rook captures on d3, and now rook to f1, attacking the f2 pawn. And this is, one of the critical moments in the game. Here Geller should have proceeded with king to g3, simply defending the f2 pawn with the king, and after king g5, threatening f4, this f3 move will be sufficient to draw the game. After g captures, rook captures, you can either move the rook, or you will not be able to push this pawn any further. If you exchange rooks, of course, this is a completely drawn endgame now, as the king is occupying a nice square in front of the pass pawn that is supposed to be pushed. So after rook to f1, rook to d2 is played, and now Fischer finds a very nice idea. Here king to h4 is played, allowing white to capture the f5 pawn. Geller captures it, king captures on f5, and now comes a move that Geller said that he thought wasn't really doing anything. Fischer pushes g3. And now you see that, of course, you cannot capture the pawn because the pawn is pinned from the f1 rook, but Geller saw all this. He simply pushes f4. And now, what do you play here? If you play something like rook to f2, then comes rook to d6, threatening rook to h6 checkmate. After you push g2, rook comes to g6, and you will not be able to push this anywhere with the black pieces. So after f4, Fischer tried king to h3. Now comes rook to d3 by Geller, pinning the g3 pawn, king back to h4 by Fischer, and now comes rook back to d2. Fischer plays rook to a1, again, simply offering Geller an opportunity to blunder the game, and, you know, it's very interesting what happens here. Here, with a move like rook to b2, it's still holdable. For example, rook to a8, rook to b7, offering, threatening to deliver some checks, g2, and now simply rook to g7, stopping the passed pawn. King to h3, now comes king to e6, preparing to push his own passed pawn, and now after the king prepares to escort the pawn, you will simply capture it, and after f5, you will either have to check the white king constantly, or you will have to wait for white to promote his pawn and then capture it with the rook, and it's a draw. But here, after rook to a1, king to e5 was played. Geller simply thought, I'll simply make room for my pawn to be pushed forward, and then when Fischer queens his pawn, I'll simply capture it, and then he will have to give up his rook for my pawn as well. But unfortunately for Geller, king to e5 was a terrible blunder, and you know, who could blame him? This is move 71, I don't know, could be 6th, 7th hour of the game. It's hard to say. And now try to pause the video here and try to find the only move that wins the game for black, and it is a move that Fischer played. So I will give it a couple of seconds if you want to just, you know, check it out. So, you know, feel free to do it. It's a very nice idea. For those of you who were able to do it, congratulations. You are an excellent endgame player. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, if you found rook to h3, king to h3, then you will not be winning this endgame, because now white can simply push f5. And after something like rook to e1 check, you can use the f4 square for your king. Rook to f1 check, king simply moves, and now you will be able to push your own pawn. g2 is coming, white can simply grab the pawn, and after king captures, you will simply play f6, king g6, push the pawn, push the king, and then promote, and black will have to sacrifice his rook for the pawn. But if you found king to g4, then you are winning this game. You have taken away the f4 square for white's king, and now it's all over. f5 was played by Geller. Fischer played rook to a5 check. If you found rook to e1 check, it's also playable. In the game, Fischer played rook to f5 check, and here Geller simply resigned the game. The f4 square is no longer available to the king, and it doesn't matter what you play. Now, next move, Fischer will capture the f5 pawn. So, for example, if you play king e4, rook captures on f5 is played, and now you cannot stop this pawn from promoting. Whatever you play, rook to c2, rook to g5 is coming, simply positioning the rook behind the passed pawn. And after whatever white plays, you will simply move the king, and now you cannot stop this pawn from being promoted, as both the king and the rook are escorting it. So after rook to a5 check, Efim Geller resigned the game, and yet another victory for Bobby Fischer in this tournament in round 12. So it's very interesting, you know, playing so many moves, 71 moves, and who knows how many hours into this game. But, you know, Fischer just, you know, wanted to win this game, and in the end, Geller cracked. So yeah, something that often happens to Carlsen's opponents. If you've seen Carlsen versus Navarra in round 1 of the Bill Chess Festival 2018, pretty much the same thing. But you know, that's why when someone offers you a draw, if you feel comfortable in your endgame skill, you know, just play it out. Maybe you'll win. You know, if you lose, then you should brush up on your endgame. But you know, if it's a draw, then it will be a draw. If not, perhaps you'll grab a full point. So yeah, that's the game. I do hope you enjoyed it. Round 12 of the 1970 Palma de Mallorca Interzonal tournament between Efim Geller and Bobby Fischer. I would like to thank Saurav Sen, Hector Coronado, and Danny McCullough for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the Bobby Fischer series, and perhaps with another game from the Bill Chess Festival. Thank you all, and I'll see you soon.